couldn't hope for a better, theme of a program for our paper. So there's going to be a lot of switches. So can you, right. So the idea of the paper is really to focus on conditions under which technological change is not in an investor's best interest. So let me start with an illustration to give you like the scenario we have in mind. So you can move to the next slide. And so assume you have I'm happy to talk about banks here. So I'll call this investor a bank. So assume you have an investor that is a bank, and this bank has made a loan to this firm I, firm 1, and this loan is being backed by some collateral. Now comes in this second firm, so you can move on to the next slides, and this firm 2 now asks for a loan for a project that is more or less similar to the firm 1's project, to the same bank. Now the only difference between those two projects is that firm 2 uses a new technology. Right. And so when the bank realized that the firm 2 brings in this innovative technology, there could be two outcomes that the bank may want to take into account. The first one would be that should this technology be superior, firm 2 entering the market could steal away some of the business from firm 1. And so there would be an effect on the probability of default and the performance of firm 1. You can move on to the next slide. The second effect could be that because the technology firm 2 brings in is superior, maybe part of the collateral that was posted by firm 1, that could be the machinery that firm 1 uses, will be devalued. So that would be the next slide. And so now the bank has to take into account these effects and decide whether the bank wants to make a loan to this firm 2. And this friction is what we're going to talk about when we talk about asset overhang. So our formal definition of an asset overhang is going to be a situation in which a financier faces reduced incentive to fund a firm's profitable and innovative project due to the negative externalities this project imposes upon the financier's legacy positions, right? So that might be interesting on its own, but this is a micro story. Ultimately, what we care about is the fact that firm 2 does find funding. So maybe this bank 1 has this asset overhang, but maybe there's another bank out there that doesn't face it. What we care about in the end is what happens at the aggregate level. So you can move on to the next slide. And the question will be how this presence of this asset overhang will impact an economy's capacity to promote and innovate, and promote disruptive technologies, right? And so the paper is really trying to find the intersection between those two stories. So you can move on to the next slide and switch directly to the next one. And so let me give you the preview of our results. The paper has basically two legs. One is a theoretical leg where we basically develop a very simple model where we show conditions under which asset overhang may hinder the financing and development of technological disruption. And the story here is simply that at the individual level, investors will internalize the cost of the externality on their portfolio, and they will demand a compensation from the firm, which in turn increases the rationing of disruptive projects. Now, at the aggregate level, the extent of this barrier will be determined by the market structure of your banking system. Typically, the way you can think about it is the higher and more homogeneous is the distribution of this asset overhang across the population of banks or investors, the greater will be the rationing against disruptive technologies. So once we have these theoretical predictions, we move on to an empirical application, and we focus on climate change because we believe this is a perfect fit for our story. So, basically here what we will try to think about is the extent to which the existence of an asset overhang hinders the financing of green technologies, right? But what we have in mind is not only innovation per se. I need to flag this here because a lot of time people move away and only focus on innovation. We focus on both generating new ideas, but then buying and selling those ideas, right? So we care about innovation and we care about diffusion of technologies. And so I think, starting from yesterday, I think the motivation for studying this is quite clear. There is a huge threat of technological disruption in this area, and a lot of investors, especially banks, especially in Europe, especially in Belgium, are highly exposed to this. Right? And so using data from Belgium, what we find is first evidence for this negative externality. So we do find that the presence of green firms in an economy impacts negatively other firms, both in terms of probabilities of default, but also in terms of collateral devaluation. And this translates back into risks for the investors. And then we find a link between the existence of those risks and the extent to which the originators of those risks, so the green firms, get rationed to a larger extent. All right, so we can move on to the next slide. So let me unpack this a little bit, and I promise I'll be as I'll try to be as clear as possible on the theory side. So you can move on to the next slide, but I think it's quite straightforward because our model is shamefully simple. So you can move on to the next slide. All right, so it basically consists of a very simple extension of the standard corporate finance model of Holmstrom and Tirol. And the story is an investor has to make a decision on whether to make an investment faced with moral hazard. So basically, firm 2 here comes in, wants some investment, but the problem is that the project of firm 2 has a positive NPV only in case firm 2 exerts some effort that is not observable from the investor's perspective. So the only solution to make everything incentive compatible is that the investor will request that firm 2 brings in part of her own cash to have stake in that project, right? If the firm is not able to bring in her own cash, then the investor will decide to ration and to drop off the project. So that's the standard setting, and the way in which we extend it, you can move on to the next slide, will be by recovering the setting I mentioned in the introduction. So now we have this firm 1, firm 2 comes in, requests the loan, but the investor realizes that if this firm 2 comes into market, it will have an effect on its portfolio, right? Here I'll just focus the story on the collateral shock, but in the paper we show that you can run the same logic through if you want to focus on probabilities of default. And then in the empirical section, we use both channels. All right, we can move on to the next slide. So to understand the effect of this collateral shock, let's start with a baseline where we assume there would be no spillover. In that case, the profit that the investor makes from firm 2 is determined by this profit function here, where basically you see that the rationing zone is below the blue A bar, right? So A here is the cash that the firm has to bring in. If the firm is not able to bring cash that is higher to A bar, the investor decides to drop that project. Now we can move on to the next slide. And what you see is that once you trigger this technological disruption inside the story, what happens is a shift downwards of the profit function of the investor, which extends the rationing barrier zone of the project from the blue A bar to the purple A bar. So basically this extension means that these disruptive firms face a penalty. That is, if they have cash that is between those two A bars, now they will be rationed. So their project will be penalized because either they bring some disruption to the economy or because the bank has made this loan previously to firm 1. If there was none of these 2 points, these firms, they would be financed, and now they can't be financed anymore. All right? So this is a story in case we have a monopoly bank. And so the next part of the theory is to say, okay, what happens if we have a competitive setting and we have multiple banks in the story? So you can move on 2 slides. Yeah, one more. And so now we say, okay, we have a competitive setting, multiple banks, but let's start with a story where they're all exposed in the same way to this technological disruption, right? They all share more or less the same exposure. In that case, you can move on to the next slide. The story is more or less the same as before. Profit function changes just because of bargaining power. And then the final part of the story is, okay, what happens if now banks are heterogeneous, right? If they have different legacy positions, which means they're exposed in different ways to this technological shock. You can move on to the next slide. I'm sorry, there were plenty of like small step slides in the between. And you can move on to the next slide. And so basically, if we have these like differential exposures across our banking system, what will happen and what we find is that what will determine the rationing zone will be the institution with the weakest legacy position. So you can move on to the next slide. And so basically here, what we find is that if the firm is able to meet this, the requirement by the weakest position, the firm will get funded. But what is important is that by virtue of competition, this funding may come from the entire financial system, right? Because at that point, we know that at least one investor will be willing to invest. And so all the other investors, they realize that the shock will materialize no matter what happens on their decision. And so now they all have a reason to pitch in to recoup some of the losses, right? So this rationing zone is set by the weakest position for the entire banking system. All right, we can move on to the next slide. So in the paper, we do discuss a lot of extensions and aspects of the model, but here what I really want to take away from this part is 2 empirical predictions. First one is what we call a legacy effect, which is going to be the following statement. Any increase in the exposures of the financial system towards the negative externality brought by a certain technology should lead to more rationing. So that's basically like the first set of results I showed. And then related to this last part, we have a market structure effect, which is any decrease in the lowest exposure of the financial system towards this shock should lead to less rationing. Okay? So now we take these two predictions and we try to apply them in the context of climate change. So you can move on to the next slide. And we use data from Belgium, so we focus on the case of Belgium, which is highly bank-based, highly homogeneous system, only 4 banks, at the top. You can move on to the next one. All right, and so in order to address these two hypotheses, we need to take 2 steps. The first one is we first need to understand how the presence of a green firm affects other firms, right? We want to confirm like this implicit hypothesis that we make in the theory, that is, we want to see this shock. And so how do we do so? You can move on to the next slide. So first we need to identify green firms in our economy, and then identify the firms which will be affected via this collateral channel, the firms that will be affected via this probability of default channels or performance channel, and the other firms, right? So to do that, you can move on to the next slide. We first identify green firms in our economy based off of either because they would be green because they innovate, green product, green processes, or because they diffuse, that is either they buy or sell green services and green products. Yeah, they buy or sell green services and products. So that would be our green identification strategy. Now you can move on to the next slide. The next question is, how do they interact with other firms in our economy? And so in order to do that, we use the production network. So we have information about who buys from whom and who sells to whom. And so using that, we construct for a given firm the product space. That is going to be the other firms which are close to this firm in terms of outputs. And then we have the technology space, which will be firms that are close to the green firms in terms of inputs. And you can move on to the next slide. And our question will be, okay, if you connect all those things together, do you have any channels that tells us that the green activity impacts the performance of any other firm, or the green activity impacts the collateral of any other firm, right? You can move on to the next slide. So to do that, we combine several data sets together. Innovation, we use patent data. Diffusion, there is a nice structural survey in Belgium that asks firms to tell us if they buy or sell green products and services. For the product space, technology space, we use transaction data, tax data. And then for anything related to the firm's performance, collateral, credit information, banks, we use firms' annual accounts, credit registry, and banks' balance sheets. All right, so you can move on 2 slides, because I'll just summarize this. And so this is what we find, right? So what we find is, in terms of performance, any green activity reduces the performance of other firms if they are close in the product space, if they are close in their outputs, if they sell the same thing, if they compete in the selling. In terms of collateral, what we find is that green activities in terms of green process innovation and green product adoption will reduce the collateral value of firms competing in the technology space. So firms that compete in buying stuff, right, in the inputs. All right, next slide. Armed with this, so now we've identified channels where there is some sort of contagion. Now the question is, can we construct from this an asset overhang, so a legacy of banks against those firms, and then see if there's a link between that and the credit decisions? Next slide. So this is the summary, right? So we've identified which firms are whom. Now we want to see how, given how the financial system is exposed to those exposed firms, what will be the capacity of this green firm to get financing. Next slide. All right, and so the strategy is simply going to be that for any green firm I, we construct a list of firms, which is this big I here, which are all the firms exposed in any way to the activity of this firm because of performance or collateral. Using this vector, for each bank, we construct a measure theta, which is going to be our asset overhang measure, which is going to be the legacy of bank B that is at risk because of the activity of firm I. Right? And we compute it simply by computing the share of credit that bank B has against those firms which are negatively impacted by the presence of firm I. And then once we have those thetas, we basically construct a vector of thetas for the entire banking system, and we will analyze the statistical properties of this theta to determine the effect of legacy effect and market structure effect. We can move on to the next slide. So we do a bunch of analysis, but here I'll just focus on one result, which is what happens at the extensive margin. So here we look at the extent to which a firm is able to get a loan from the banking system as a function of the structure of the asset overhang distribution. So for our legacy effect story, we look at the median value of the asset overhang in the banking system. And for a market structure effect, we look at the minimum value of this overhang across the banking system. And our theory predicts that the 2 coefficients should be negative, right? So we can move on to the next slide. And so basically that's what we find in the data. So we find those two coefficients to be negative. And so to give you an idea of the economic value of those coefficients, basically for the green effect, we find that a green firm is more likely to be rationed than a green firm that has a 1 standard deviation increase in the median overhang it imposes, has a 4. If it's innovator, it has 4. It is 4.4 percentage points more likely to be rationed compared to a green firm that doesn't have any overhang, right? So everything is about the overhang. It's not only about whether you're green or not, it's the extent to which you're threatening the rest of the economy. And this value is 1 percentage point for diffusers. For the market structure effect, we see that a drop in the minimum exposure of the system towards the activity of a given firm increases the likelihood that this firm is going to be financed. 5.4 percentage points if it's an innovator, 1.3 if it's a diffuser. Then we do a lot of other analysis, but we can move on to the next. How much time do I have?
About 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Okay, then I rest for nothing, but it's okay. Let's. So the last thing I want to discuss is the policy implications of those results, which basically means that we believe those results are interesting for policymakers who want to promote investors' incentive to stimulate the entry and diffusion of disruptive technology, typically green technology. And basically what's important from our story is that what you want is to have investors who are not exposed to the incumbent problem, right? Who do not have this legacy of exposures. Because if you only have one significant investor that does have this, then by virtue of the market structure effect, you will force the rest of the economy to follow on to this investment, right? And so you can translate this into promoting alternative models. So typically Belgium is quite of a concentrated and homogeneous system where financing mostly comes from 4 banks. So you can develop alternative funding sources, can promote collateral policies that, because ultimately here the collateral that is collateral that is exposed to the technology. But if your collateral is government bonds, it's not exposed to this technology. So you may want to have policies that addresses the sensitivity of the collateral towards the potential disruption. You can also impose this through macroprudential tools, but maybe one last thing I want to clarify here is we focus on the technology, but ultimately, like the framework we have may apply to other cases. And what you need in terms of ingredients to start thinking about the effect of this asset overhang on the rest of the economy is related to the extent to which your pool of eligible investors is commonly exposed to this credible shock, right? And so other applications where you could find this are cases of niche technologies where you only have a few investors who have the knowledge, but who are also quite exposed to any changes there. Could also be a case of developing economies, but finally, you could also have this when you have public finances, right? Where this could go back to the first setting where you have a monopoly investor who then has a stake in, not changing too much the status quo and not changing too much and not allowing for any disruptive technology to come in. And in the paper, we have a nice reference to the case in France of the Minitel, which, could be a nice story to sort of follow up on this asset overhang. All right, let me conclude with the last slide. So what we do in this paper is we propose an asset overhang theory where what we try to demonstrate is that legacies may induce investors, banks, to borrow the financing of technological change, that is entry and development of disruptive technology, and we show that there is a key role to be played here by the market structure over this asset overhang. In the context of climate finance and green transition, we find empirical evidence that shows that green activity does adversely affect competing firms' operation and asset pledgeability, so performance and collateral. And then we also show that banks' legacy positions against those effects and the overhang distribution across the market are important drivers for the access of banks' finance for green firms at both extensive margin and intensive margin. We conclude by saying that policies accounting for the discrepancies in legacy exposures, so really back to this idea of market structure effect, to technological disruption may be key to aligning incentives and redirecting funding towards otherwise profitable innovative projects. All right, let me stop here and thank you very much for your time.
Very good. Thank you, Tariq, for a very good presentation. We have the discussant is Irem Erten from Warwick Business School.
Can I also change the slides?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, my name is Martin. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to discuss this very detailed and interesting paper. I really enjoyed reading it and learned a lot from it. So I would like to start by summarizing a bit the paper because it's really big, really detailed. So I want to first a little bit give an overview of my key takeaways. So in this paper, the research questions that the authors tackle is, do banks ration the borrowers that would have a negative impact on their legacy borrowers due to the disruptive technologies? And what they do is to theoretically model this asset overhang problem and then test the empirical predictions. And the key friction is that the new disruptive technologies may reduce the collateral value or weaken the performance of the legacy borrowers. And the key finding that the authors show is that green innovators or diffusers that can generate negative externalities on the legacy borrowers are less likely to receive bank credit. And that can be a barrier of green firms getting financing. And that's the key takeaway. Therefore, these legacy positions in investors' portfolios may hinder the optimal allocation of funds in green firms. And the authors generate lots of interesting policy implications from the theory and empirics. For example, they suggest that considering this legacy investors and then proposing initiatives that would eliminate this asset overhang problem due to the legacy borrowers can optimize the asset allocation in green financing. And they propose very interesting macroprudential regulations that may lead to less rationing. In terms of the theoretical model, very brief summary I'd like to do is it's based on a standard Holmstrom and Tyrrell model. They start with a simple monopoly investor setting, and then they introduce asset overhang, which is about the externality of reducing the collateral value of legacy investors due to the disruptive technologies. And that can also arise due to lower performance as well as asset devaluation. And the key empirical prediction comes from this legacy effect. An increase in negative externalities will lead to more rationing. So banks will be more likely to ration borrowers that will have this negative externality. Empirical evidence, they find support for this prediction in this Belgium setting. They look at externalities again, both in terms of performance and asset devaluations, and then they construct pairwise measures that would allow them to quantify these externalities, and then they do quantify these externalities before testing this rationing effect. And what's the key finding they have? They find that at extensive margin, this asset overhang problem reduces the likelihood of financing these disruptive innovators. So there is a rationing problem that these negative externalities will generate. And that, I think, is a very plausible and can be one of the biggest challenges of incorporating climate change into the lending decisions of the bank. So I do think it's a very good channel to investigate. Very interesting paper, very clearly written. It's a huge paper that I think it has two different papers on its own because of theory and empirics and so on. I really like the fact that the empirics and theory are very well tied together. They follow them very closely. There are lots of data sets in the paper, both to quantify the size of the externalities and to investigate implications, very meticulous. Stylized model, that very well-known corporate finance model that the authors tweak for very plausible implications. So I really like, very positive on the paper. I have some comments which may be useful, hopefully, for the authors. So I really like the theory, and I think it's quite clear. But I think the authors, if they want, they can do some more in terms of the empirics. For example, one comment I would have is in terms of the empirical tests, and maybe if I was the author, I would start by focusing on first the proximity measures in terms of understanding and constructing this legacy channel. So why not focus on these proximities both in the input and output space before moving to quantifying the externalities? Because it's reasonable to expect that if you have more proximity between the legacy borrowers and the borrower, the new borrower, then you would have more of this rationing problem. So the proximity measure itself, I think it may be a good start to do the analysis, because when you have both the proximity and the externalities, you have two layers of endogeneity, and so it may be good maybe to also add that and then try to see to what extent the endogeneity can be tackled there. For example, in some sectors like technology, you may have higher proximity, and then that also induces different sensitivity to shocks, and maybe that's something to do a little bit more in that direction. And one other comment that I had is I think it would be interesting to maybe add, if the authors think it's a good idea, to add patents and citations. They focus mainly on input and output space, which I think is quite new, very interesting. But also I think patent and citations could be interesting. There will be the positive information spillovers that the authors may want to consider, and to understand maybe the lower bound of these externalities, but also the patent citations could be maybe to see to what extent maybe, at least in the long run, these negative externalities could be mitigated by that. So patents and citations could be maybe another channel, I think this paper and a follow-up paper to consider. And more minor comments is maybe it might make sense to explore the classification further. So as far as I understand, the authors have a very detailed classification. They've really meticulously done, but it's static, I think. So what they can do, if they want, is to also maybe consider the dynamic nature of these classifications and see to what extent firms switch across types in your setup, and to what extent that can change. And maybe that may not be possible in the input and output space, but they may do that quite, I think, easily if they consider patenting and patent citations and innovation and so on. That can be a way to see that. So to conclude, I think very interesting paper. I really like the novel and interesting policy implications. I think they say quite a lot of new things that both regulators and economists haven't really thought about. And I wish you good luck and look forward to the final version.
Thank you very much, Irem, for a very clear discussion. I'm opening the floor now for questions, both from the audience and from virtually from the via the chat. But maybe meanwhile, now before we get the first questions, maybe Tariq, if you want to respond to the comments.
Yeah. So thank you so much for these comments. So my answers will probably be incomplete. I think in terms of proximity measures, the idea here, and I'm happy to think about what you're proposing, and it's probably it could probably produce new results. But our main approach was to let the data tell us who is close to whom. So we didn't want to impose, given the data we had, we could afford not to impose any a priori structure upon who is close to whom in our economy, right? So we are not saying we take two firms that are part of the same industry, because two firms may be part of the same industry, but one is in the north, one is in the south, and ultimately they don't affect each other. The only way in which we connect them is if they share part of their activity in terms of exactly like competing firms at the upstream or downstreams. And so what we liked about this setting was that these channels would emerge, right? It would be endogenous. We could obviously now compose or further study these to get a better view of the extent to which different sectors, different regions may produce different That I understand, and that would be indeed interesting to understand. And I had a conversation yesterday about this, that obviously different sectors, typically in the green space, are affected in different ways. Yesterday's keynote, showed that manufacturing would be more relevant for these than services, and the retail. So typically there would be something we could look into for sure. So on the classification part, so I think that would be like an amazing setting where you would want to see how green conversion, right? It's like if you convert into a green firm, you were a brown firm before, you convert into a green firm, how does that transform your financing capacities? Unfortunately, in our data set, this is quite static. So green firms stay green firms, brown firm, or non-green firms stay brown firms, because our time span is 10 years. So if you're a green innovator, it's 2008 to 2018. So if you're a green innovator, you're likely to remain a green innovator. So it was too static to consider the dynamic, but as time goes forward, or maybe with other data sets, that would be typically something one wants to look at. And maybe one thing to complement there is, because implicit in the paper is what we focus on is the entry, right? Entry of new firms, but the elephant in the room, and I think the keynote of José Luis Pedro will address this, is what happens of firms that are incumbents and want to change and want to become more green, etc. And this is out of the scope of our paper. And there, if you had data on the dynamics of this green conversion, then you could explore this in much more detail. That's for sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think we had a question from the audience, please.
Thank you. So thanks a lot, Tariq. Very interesting paper. So I have some questions related to the choice of the definition of green firms and innovators. So I think you just answered to this, to the first one, that the green firms stay the green firms, and how this can be changed, for example, by considering either the taxonomy, so the area in which they operate, or forward-looking targets, so that you can classify also, the path on which these firms are, and add a bit of heterogeneity. And then a more general question on the innovators, and how being an innovator correlates with the age and size of the firms, because basically you assume that the innovators are not a legacy for these banks. So does it mean that they are not already in the portfolio of the banks, or they are not? They don't represent a high share in this portfolio? Because otherwise, banks would have to treat them also as a legacy, right? And if they are not in the bank's portfolio, is it because the firm is very young and small, and therefore is there already like a barrier to entry, independently of whether they are green or not? So they are mostly financed by other type of investors. How can you consider that in your model? Thanks.
Yeah, so these are two great points. To the first one, to the definition of green firms, to sort of complement what I said before, I think having information about forward-looking targets would definitely help in making the story a little bit more complete. As I said, I think the problem is, it's really the time dimension we have. I think in the span of 5 to 10 years, maybe now, but back in 2008, there weren't that many firms making these radical changes and moves and integrating them into their marketing or communication. But we need to think about this a little bit deeper and think about these transitions. Now, for the second point on innovators, right? So let me see, because there's a couple of ingredients I want to make sure I make clear here. So indeed, we have two things. So here I presented results of the extensive margin, but we also do have results on the intensive margin. So we look at the change in credit given to firms as a function of, whether they are green or not, and whether they impose an overhang on the rest of the economy or not. And that's actually where we see that if at the banking structure there's a change in the lowest overhang, there will be an effect of this on the extent to which your current credit relationship would increase or decrease. So we do try to capture this part of, if you're already part of a bank's portfolio, but the market structure changes towards your activity, how does the bank respond to this? But the second thing, so so that would be one part. But the second thing is, and you're completely right, that financing structures may differ as a function of whether you innovate or not, or your age, your status, if you're a startup, innovating, blah, blah. So that I fully take. Our first response is always, well, Belgium is highly bank financed, but when we present this paper in the US, they're like, yeah, we don't care about banks. We have VCs here, so we don't care about your story. But I would say, though, that that's also why we want to push forward the second leg of this story, which is about diffusers, right? So maybe innovation has a special financial treatment from these VCs, but diffusers and the bill that was passed in the US explicitly mentioned this. You know, the other companies that are going to decide whether they want to buy or sell green technologies, they also need to get financed. And those typically, they go to banks irrespective of their age. And so the fact that we get, even though the numbers are not the same, but that we get similar, that we get the same story for diffusers also, you know, sort of clarifies the story at the financing level. So even though Belgium is not the ideal place for innovation, I think for diffusion is quite an interesting thing to observe there. Yeah, so yeah, I guess that would be my incomplete answer to your question.
Very good, thank you. We have one question more from the audience, and then we have one on the chat. So I suggest we take them both in a row, and you answer in the interest of time together for the two questions. So please.
Thank you very much. I have just two general comments. I think you in your presentation alluded to the policy implications, and so sort of I think you could push further on that particularly here in Europe we need alternative financing sources, and you can go as far as the importance of capital market unions and as well in order to make this really work. Then my second comment may be as a result of not really understanding the dynamics of the diffusion, but it feels a bit sad that you have these innovative companies and then that results in negative position for the other firms. So what does it need to make sure that the other firms actually benefit from these innovations, that the collateral value actually would increase rather than decline? So rather than moving the A bars to right, move them to the other direction. And if you find sort of policy recommendations here, then I think all of us would be very, very happy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, the second question is quite much more technical, so maybe if you can answer this one first, and then we move finally.
Yeah, I'll be quick. So yeah, so in terms of policies for alternative financing, I think you're completely right. There's this bunch of papers, and some of them were presented here as well, that show that we have a need for alternative financing to promote this green transition. I think so. What we try to derive from the paper is that, of course, you want to have this increase of capital markets, and that would directly speak to the point of to finance innovation, but it doesn't mean that banking has to be replaced. And if you want to address the banking dimension, you might also want to promote legacy-free banks, right? And so legacy-free banks could either be banks that sort of get rid of their legacy asset in this direction, but you know, initiatives like Green Bank that you have in the UK or Green Public Banks would also be ways of forcing the introduction of the technology within the banking space, because there might be services that are financed by banks that won't be financed by the capital market, as I mentioned, like diffusion dimension. That would be my way to address this. And the second point, so I fully agree with my first, so the way, when you said it's sad, I was like, yeah, but that's creative destruction. So like that's one part of the story. But then the second part is, you're completely right. Ultimately, another bias, implicit bias in our story is we look at substitute effect between technologies, but you do also have complementary effects between technologies, whereas some firms that are green would benefit from other firms that are green in the economy, and that we sort of keep away from it also for sake of how we can trace all this. But like, this is a big thing to analyze next, is the complementarity between the disruptions that I fully take.
Thank you very much. So we have the final question from the chat, which I'm going to read loud here. So it's from Kostas Tsatsaronis. The question is as follows: I would suspect that the results of the channels identified in the paper depend critically on the effect of time on two ways. First, How long does it take for the effects of innovative firms to reach the legacy firms? And second, the maturity of the bank exposure to legacy firms.
Yeah, this is a great question. So for the first one, on the top of my head, I don't know. I know we look different. We look at different lags, and there's a lag where this starts to materialize. But we do look at this in the paper. I don't know. However, I do fully agree with the second point, and that is an interesting finding that we have, is that if you start if you start classifying position in terms of maturity, what you find is that it is the longest maturity positions that matters in determining the rationing, right? And so I think this is consistent with the theory, is if you have short-term positions, you don't care about this because the time it will materialize, the time the effect will materialize, you will be gone with your position, so you don't care. But what we find is really like it's going to be loans of 10, 20, 30 years position with large positions, which are typically strategic things that you want to take into account when you make a strategic decision that will matter in your rationing decision. So the maturity effect is there, absolutely.